welcome to all of you, and I also want to say welcome back to Charlottesville, to Travis. Travis is a Texas boy. He attended the University of Texas, but then he came here to Virginia and got a Master of Architectural History at the University of Virginia. And he's never left, I guess. Anyway, how many of you have visited Poplar Forest? Okay, the rest of you, you've got to get there, because this is what he is going to be talking about and what Travis has done. And this is not an exaggeration on my part. He has really transformed the way that historic preservation and reconstruction of historic buildings is done in this country. Poplar Forest, some of you may remember it was way back, and I guess you'll probably talk about that, but how, anyway, it's just, and of course it's this little thing out there in the middle of nowhere, you know, but that it's a very, very important building of Jefferson, and in a certain sense it's its most perfect building, but it was an absolute mess. And what Travis has done in the restoration of this building. But it isn't just about that, because what this has done is I think it has really impacted the national scene of the way that we do historic preservation, the way we do reconstruction in this country. And so it is, I say, it's a very, very important thing. A couple of other things, he's received a whole bunch of awards. I'm not going to try to go over all of them. But a couple I just did want to mention, that the AIA, the American Institute of Architects, which is the big thing, they gave him the Historic Preservation Award back in 1995. The Virginia AIA gave him a medal here in 2011. And then the University of Virginia, the School of Architecture, he was the Distinguished Alumni Award in 2021. So he's done very, very well. And what I want to say is that we're so glad that he is here, and welcome back, Travis.
Thank you. If y'all can hear me okay, I'm not going to clip on this other mic. Is everybody? Okay. Summing up what I've learned over the last 34 years at Poplar Forest could keep us here a while. I could either talk to you in great detail about one little thing of Poplar Forest, or I could hit you with a lot of things, a little bit each. So since most people are not familiar with Poplar Forest, I'm going to give you the big picture. Before I start, though, I wanted to acknowledge one of our board members, Mike Quinn, who is sitting here. A lot of you remember Mike. He was the CEO when Montpelier was restored. Really great project. He then went to Philadelphia and started the Museum of the American Revolution. And fortunately, he's now come back to Charlottesville and is a board member at Poplar Forest. So nice to see you, Mike. Okay, so let's see if this works. Okay. So it almost beggars belief to think that Thomas Jefferson's most intimate house, his second house, his retreat that was so special, that was 14 years of his life, was virtually unknown and is virtually still unknown. So who knew about Poplar Forest after Jefferson died in 1826? Not many people, because it was a well-kept secret in his time. What's still hard to understand is how it's still kind of under the radar. In the last 10 years, there were 3 major biographies of Jefferson, most of them about 500 pages. One didn't mention Poplar Forest. One had a sentence and one had a paragraph. There was even a book called The Inner Jefferson that didn't mention Poplar Forest. So it's still a well-kept secret, but that's the purpose of tonight, is to expose you to what it might mean. So Jefferson, you might say Poplar Forest was inevitable as a retreat, because Jefferson, as you know, got trapped in public life for about 40 years. But when you look at that life, he's always looking for and using retreats. When he's a boy, his daughter said he would retreat up to the Monticello mountaintop to be by himself. When he's governor in Richmond, he retreats to his Elk Hill plantation between Charlottesville and Richmond. When he's in Paris, he retreats to a hermitage across the river. And when he's in Philadelphia, he builds a little backyard retreat that had no windows and a skylight. Although the workers, when he was away, thought, how could it not have windows? So they put in the windows, and he never used it. So Jefferson, very innovative person, introverted, very in need of retreats. So why Poplar Forest? Monticello is probably the second best known private house in America after Mount Vernon. And that's the reason for Poplar Forest. It became like a hotel for people Jefferson knew, people he didn't know. If you read about him at Monticello, he locks himself in his private suite, and not even family members can get in to see him at some times. So that is obviously the reason why, even when he's retiring in 1809, he knows he can't get the peace and quiet that he needs. So Monticello is well known as early as the 1860s, and maybe a little earlier. It's on currency. In 1928, we see it on a $2 bill, which is still in circulation if you can ever see one. 1938, it appears on the nickel. 1956, it's on a stamp, and there were probably more than one. But what do you see that's common in all these images? Everybody has always liked the back of Monticello instead of the front, because it looks more impressive with the Roman dome. Sometimes people like to take pictures of the back of Poplar Forest because it looks more impressive than the front of the house. But anyway, the point is, Monticello was very well known. So while Jefferson is still in the president's house in Washington, he starts the construction of Poplar Forest. Somebody was just asking me, why did he choose that area of Virginia? It's because when his wife's father died, he inherits that property. But out of a lot of property that he inherits, he kept Poplar Forest, having to sell off all the other parts. So it's way out there. It's not quite the undeveloped frontier, but it's close to it. It's right up against the mountains. And he went to see it in 1774, right after he inherits it. And I think he loved the place because it's out in nature. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But Jefferson also wanted a remote place for his retreat. So here's the route. It's not Route 29 that you do today. It's way out to the east. It's a 3-day journey. And a lot of times he doesn't tell people where he's going or that he has another place, because he obviously doesn't want anyone to follow him there. It was barely a plantation when he inherits it, with maybe 10 enslaved people, but eventually he says it's one of his most valuable properties with about 100 enslaved people. Right the year after he inherits Poplar Forest, he has to buy one of the great wonders of nature, the natural bridge. He had gone to see it in the 1760s, and he had to buy it, which meant buying it from England. But of course, he called it one of the most sublime wonders of nature. And in early America, in Jefferson's time, there were two great natural wonders in America that were known. This was one of them. You probably know the other one up there in New York, Niagara. So the challenge is, by the time he does Poplar Forest, Jefferson is a very experienced builder. He's built Monticello, he's torn it down, rebuilt it, he's building things in Washington. He always wants to be in control, he wants to supervise, but he also knows that he's stuck in Washington, and so the challenge is he's up in Washington, his workers and workshops are at Monticello, things he orders from Europe or New England come by ship to Richmond, and everything's got to get out there to Poplar Forest. Even things from Monticello that are fragile have to go down the Rivanna and up the James. Fragile things from Richmond have to come all the way up the James on bateau boats against the current, against the rocks. But Jefferson is so in need of a retreat, he starts building Poplar Forest in 1806, 3 years before he gets out of the presidency. And that means, fortunately for us, there are letters between the White House and Poplar Forest, letters from the workers to Washington that tell us almost the whole story that we'd want to know. Okay. So we shift gears. Poplar Forest is the culmination of many architectural threads in Jefferson's life. One of the most important is the octagon shape. So when he's a college student at William and Mary, he starts buying these British handbooks by what we call the British Palladians. They're full of octagons, none of which I think were ever built, but he falls in love with the shape. And he starts drawing octagons, and he does so for the rest of his life. Poplar Forest, we'll see, was his ultimate. This, however, was the first plan he envisions for Poplar Forest. It's not the full octagon, but it's a type of plan that he does over and over and over with a octagon room that sticks out as a semi-octagonal bay. So Jefferson being Jefferson, he can't just let things take their course. In 1806, he's got to drop what he's doing in Washington, go to Bedford, and as he told his daughter, help the bricklayer lay out the foundation. This is not telling the bricklayer how to lay a brick. It's probably telling him how to do an octagon, which was the most complicated shape for anybody to do. And he first starts with a pure octagon, being very idealistic, and he struggles with this over and over and over. Where do you put the stairs in this two-story house? Anything he does kind of messes up the geometry, so eventually he just sticks the staircases on the outside. And originally it didn't have the two porticos, north and south. He wants a very pure octagon. It's not practical. But let me just interject here. Where those stair pavilions are on the left and right tells you everything about what this house was. You only get to the stairs in this two-story house by going through someone's bedchamber. That tells us that he did not mean the public to ever be here. It's all about privacy. There are many, many layers of privacy in this design. So he uses his bricklayer and his carpenter from Monticello to start the shell of Poplar Forest. And so for 3 years, these workers are going back and forth, back and forth. The white workers have their own enslaved workers. And the point is, by 1809, Jefferson wants to start using Poplar Forest when he gets out of public life. It's still a shell, but that didn't matter. He'd never lived in a finished house before. So one of the important parts of the story is who finished Poplar Forest. The work we call the joinery, the finished woodwork outside, inside, was done by John Hemmings, the enslaved craftsman from Monticello, who by this time is the master craftsman at Monticello. And more importantly, John Hemmings has 3 nephew apprentices who happen to be Jefferson's sons, biracial sons. They worked there building their father's dream house for 10 years. That's the real unknown story and a very poignant story. And a good amount of that story is in my book. So Jefferson starts using Poplar Forest in 1809. I'll read you a couple of quotes. In 1809, he says, "Never did a prisoner released from his chains feel such relief as I shall on shaking off the shackles of power." He also said in 1812, "When finished, it will be the best dwelling house in the state, except that of Monticello, but perhaps preferable to that as more proportioned to the faculties of a private citizen." That was the key, private. And one more, and he also wrote a friend, "I have fixed myself comfortably, keep some books here, bring others occasionally. I'm in the solitude of a hermit and quite at leisure to attend to my absent friends." Absent friends meant a lot of letter writing. Jefferson, over and over and over, when he's getting out of the presidency, writes friends that his goal is tranquility, but it's to go to his friends, his family, his farms, and his books. That's a refrain over and over and over. Most people would put down friends, family, and farms. Jefferson has to include books. They are very important. So he had a special library put together for Poplar Forest of about 1,000 books. They're not what you need for government or law, but they are what he wants in retirement. So eventually, in 1815, he starts bringing 2 teenage granddaughters with him, Ellen and Cornelia Randolph. Their mother gets stuck back at Monticello as the hostess, but they come frequently with Jefferson, and later in the 1850s, they write some poignant histories of life with grandfather. And that's another thing we don't always think about with Jefferson, Jefferson as a grandfather. One of them said, "At Poplar Forest, he found in a pleasant home rest, leisure, and the power to carry on his favorite pursuits, to think, to study, and to read." And in fact, if his one manservant who usually came with him wasn't in the house, the historic sound of Poplar Forest is this. It's the sound of his mind, thinking, reading, and writing. And if you're in the house and you understand that simple thing, you understand Poplar Forest. So Jefferson turns over the house to his grandson, Francis Epps, in 1823, kind of prematurely. Jefferson hadn't finished the house, had wanted to keep using it, but Francis got married and needed a house. So Jefferson last went there in 1823. Francis lives there for 5 years with his bride, and in 1828, 2 years after Jefferson dies, sells Poplar Forest for a fraction of its value and moves to the newest American frontier. You might know what that is. Northern Florida is where he moved. Only 6 or 7 years before he went there, it was still Spanish. Northern Florida is a wilderness, but don't think Miami, think Alabama, Georgia. He does well. He first lives in a log cabin with all the poplar forest stuff he took down there. Eventually, he becomes governor. He builds a nice mansion. He's the father of the Episcopal Church. He starts a college like his grandfather did, and did pretty well in the wilderness of northern Florida. But Poplar Forest then goes into another family, the Cobbs Hutter family, and they are there for 117 years. It slowly kind of changes. The people who bought it probably did not appreciate the modernistic retreat that Jefferson built. But most importantly, it changed for a good reason. In 1845, there was a fire that burned the house, and one of the Hutter relatives wrote a letter to him saying, "Sorry to hear about your fire, but we understand you can make some valuable improvements in the house." What did that mean? They want a good old farmhouse. They brick up 8 windows. They get rid of the 20-foot cube room. They get rid of the skylight, the pediments, the balustrade, the Chinese railing. They put in walls, take out walls. They want a good old dark farmhouse. So that's the 1840s. And here's, it was a kind of a cheap Greek revival style that they did. And Jefferson's wonderful landscape gardens eventually kind of disappeared. So 100 years later, we have the modern family, the Watts family, and they open up the bricked up windows, they restore the parlor, but they want a modern country house in 1946. What does that mean? 5 bathrooms, modern kitchen, mechanical systems, closets, all the things that you would need in a modern house. So this is the picture when I start, 1989, and the question is, where is Jefferson in this picture? So 40 years ago, after several failed attempts, 5 local people got together and finally rescued Poplar Forest, 1983. It only kept 49 acres with the house out of Jefferson's 5,000. That went down to 1,000 when he died. So over the years, we now have 620 acres out of the 1,000 that he ended up with. And more recently, if you haven't been there, you would experience the 2.2-mile new parkway through the 600 acres. That is a really wonderful experience that gives you the sense of the plantation. So it's a long story. Really great architectural advisors who joined the restoration team in 1990. Consulting architects, Jeff Baker and John Misick, who have been the consulting architects at Farmington, at Monticello, UVA, and still at Poplar Forest. So here's where we start. Again, the house is a combination of Jefferson, 1840s, 1940s, and again, I'll just go through these quickly. A lot of very slow investigative processes. This is one of the most idealistic projects because we never had an artificial deadline. The professional team called the shots. Sometimes the evidence was as big as your fingernail. Sometimes the evidence is microscopic. But we had all the time to come up with the questions and then to find the answers. A lot of great artifacts that told us what Jefferson was doing. And the house as a document was on top of all the letters, some 1,500 documents related to Poplar Forest that are usually unheard of on any kind of early house research or history. So about 3 years later, we finally know, ever since the house was seen in 1845, what Jefferson had designed, what he built, what it looked like, how it was put together, what the rooms were like. And that was the beginning of the project of putting it back together. A lot of conservation work to kind of keep the place up. Trying to use the same materials, and in this case, this meant burning limestone to get the putty for plaster or render or mortar. Putting back the volumes, the middle room had lost 8 feet on the top of the wall in 1846. Putting back the large windows of the parlor, doing the same framing you saw at Monticello and at UVA. Again, relearning some old tricks that went back to the Romans, like how to make a brick column look like a stone column. Using this new material, Jefferson loved tinned shingles, which was very important because the wood shingles had caught fire when his grandson was living there. And Jefferson said, "That's okay, I just discovered this great new thing called tinned shingles." The same classical things you've seen at Monticello, UVA. This really is a Jeffersonian classicism with the same syntax. All the parts are kind of the same, but they're just put together in different ways. Sometimes new things like the largest skylight, I think, in America on a house. And again, once we got to the interior, we did something very important. We started doing the same sequence of Jefferson building the house. So if we know he did something in 1810, we did that, and we followed that year after year so that you coming as a visitor experienced a Jeffersonian process, seeing the house unfold as he did. And he saw it unfold for 14 years, a little faster than we did. And the 2 octagonal privies are also wonderful little temples of necessity using Palladian proportions. But one of the most important things was the service wing. And you've seen the Monticello wings, U-shaped service wings. They're based on Palladian villa wings. But right before Poplar Forest, Jefferson has added 200-foot wings on the White House, the East Wing, the West Wing. They're not today's West Wing. They were service wings. And they have, importantly, his signature roof, which gives you a flat deck to use for strolling, sitting. And this is what the wing, 100-foot wing, looked like after the 1840s. Basically, 2 rooms, 1 and 2 disappeared. 2 rooms were made into 2 buildings. This was a 9-year project to put this back together in the same way, same materials. Having done that, we realized why nobody else but Jefferson did these things. This is the modern kitchen, just a scaled down version from Monticello. And this is the finished wing. Jefferson had no railings. But I think this is Jefferson's only architectural invention, this flat deck. We look at it today and say, oh, it's a deck, big deal. He's the first person to do these. It's really a hidden roof with a deck on top. But he does these for 20 years, over and over and over. And it's really important for him to be out in nature. That's what it looks like. He only did one, which throws the house off balance. So once we got back into the interior, every piece of wood that you'll see today on the interior has been made by hand. Sometimes with Jefferson-era tools, and sometimes with Jefferson-era wood from the property, old-growth heart poplar from the Poplar Forest. The reason Jefferson chose that site out of 5,000 acres was it was right next to the Poplar Forest, which was an old-growth forest. As early as the 1740s, people referred to it as the forest, or the Poplar Forest. It's a distinctive place of nature. So all the woodwork has been done traditionally. These 6 sets of what he called sash doors are the first things that John Hemmings made for the house. making them into Monticello workshops. The Hemmings men also made these walnut doors for the house, 2 of which survived, and they became the prototypes of the new ones that we've had made out of Virginia walnut. It's pretty easy to see that Jefferson wants to show off the artwork of Virginia nature with these extraordinary walnut doors. So Jefferson is always fascinated by Roman moldings and detail. So the entablature moldings, the things that go on the top of the wall underneath an imaginary column or a real column, were very important to him. And so in the middle room at Poplar Forest, he chooses the Baths of Diocletian that you've seen at Monticello, UVA. But here he, in addition to the face of Apollo, he adds the bucrania, the ox skull, because he said he wants to indulge his fancy. So this is the minor Tuscan entablature in the house. But the Doric entablature for the middle room was made by hand. It was 1,700 parts. And you see them being assembled. Here it's going up together. And this is the last view of Poplar Forest that Jefferson saw. He walked into this central 20-foot cube dining room and saw the entablature completed but without its ornaments. And this is what he would have marveled at because he had spent years imagining the finished house. So one of the most exciting phases of the restoration was the last one we did, which was the paint finishes in the house. We had the historic painters, people that you go to for these things, on site for 4 weeks, hand making the pigments and doing this distemper finish that really hasn't been done much since Jefferson's time. On the left there, it goes on, it kind of looks like jelly. It's got a short shelf life. It goes on black. You can't retouch anything, and then within an hour, it dries to its finished color. You talk about the excitement of watching paint dry. It was really an extraordinary thing. I only took 1,500 pictures and videos of. Here's the finished dining room. Jefferson, we had hundreds of pieces of plaster telling us what the colors and finishes were. Gray, 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 gray. He does a lot of gray at Monticello. It was a popular color in the early 19th century. This is the parlor with a little different color gray. The reason you'd use distemper, which is made out of hide glue, is if you want color on your new plaster walls, you have to use distemper or lime wash. If you want oil, you wait a couple of years for the plaster to dry. Here are the ornaments installed in the top of the 20-foot cube. Oh, sorry. So, shifting gears, again, this is a really short version of the landscape. What Jefferson's doing at Poplar Forest is not so much what he's doing at Monticello. It's what he intended to do at the White House but didn't do. So a lot of the features that end up at Poplar Forest, he wanted to do in Washington. And I'm not going to go into all of this. There are captions for all of this in my book, but it's a very unique, integrated, unusual landscape. And this is the finished front lawn, minus some more recent oval beds of roses. But most of the north side of the house landscape has already been done, not the south or beyond the round ring road. So we might ask, Poplar Forest, so what? Why is it important? It's really the missing link to discovering all of Jefferson's work as an architect and a builder. What he did before, what he did after, is all related to what he does in the middle at Poplar Forest. It's what we call Jeffersonian classicism, but you have to always remember what Poplar Forest was. why he built it. It's a retreat. It's not a conventional house, and because it's not a conventional house, it can be different. So I'm going to read you a short description. James Ackerman, who wrote the history of the villa, which is a 2,000-year-old building type, he says, a villa is a building in the country designed for its owner's enjoyment and relaxation. Though it may also be the center of an agricultural enterprise, the pleasure factor is what essentially distinguishes the villa residence from the farmhouse and the villa estate from the farm. The farmhouse tends to be simple in structure and to conserve ancient farms that do not require the intervention of a designer. The villa is typically the product of an architect's imagination and asserts its modernity. I mean, that is a perfect description of Poplar Forest. And Ackerman contends that the villa as a retreat hasn't changed for 2,000 years. So back to that favorite shape. This, as far as I can tell, is the first full-size octagon house in America. There might have been one other, but from the 18th century, but it disappeared. Nobody knows much about it. But Jefferson plays with this shape over and over and over. And to give you some sense, these are all the ways he uses a unique type of octagon. Those. Now, all of those were really him playing around on paper, but it sort of like Leonardo da Vinci, you can see his mind at work on paper as he plays with all these forms. So we always have to talk about Palladio. Palladio, Jefferson said, was his Bible, and he certainly, at Poplar Forest, all of the dimensions of the house vertically and in every piece of wood molding in the house is by Palladian proportions. Even when Jefferson sends a letter to the worker with Palladian inches, he sometimes has 5 or 6 decimal places on the dimension. And that's because he's having to convert Palladian Italian inches into American inches. But he loves math. He loves to crunch numbers. He has pages and pages and pages of these kind of figures. How he does that, I can't tell you. And I used to think that Poplar Forest was really a nod to Palladio's Villa Rotunda, which was a central room. It's bilaterally symmetrical. Jefferson tried to build a copy of it for the governor's house and then the president's house. And you can kind of read the Villa Rotunda in this plan. But if you want to overlay Poplar Forest on the Villa Rotunda, this cross section, it's pretty convincing. But Jefferson never takes anything from one source. He's taking it from many, many sources. Instead of the dome Palladio had, Jefferson has his own flat roof. But more Palladian are the mounds on either side of the house that Jefferson uses as pavilions in a 5-part Palladian plan. So one of the things that I said you have to always remember is Poplar Forest was an occasional retreat, and because of that, it could be very modern. So Jefferson only invited 2 non-family people to come to Poplar Forest, 2 foreign friends. One of them was a man named George Flower, an Englishman, and he wrote a description of Poplar Forest, and he ended up by saying it was like a French chateau. So he was an Englishman who sees it as French. How is it French? It's got the skylight that are all over Paris when Jefferson's there for 5 years. It's got these glass doors. It's got what he called a European floor, meaning it has a finish. It's got these very transparent walls that connect the indoors and the outdoors. It's got these triple sash windows in place of what we call French doors. It was very French in its light and air. And of course, it has the alcove for the French alcove beds. But more and more, I think the middle room at Poplar Forest is really Paris. So when Jefferson is in Paris, there are a dozen or more new houses where you walk in the front door into someone's dining room, which is unheard of in an American house. And in that dining room, it's a very tall central room with a skylight followed by a parlor. So I really think this dining room at Poplar Forest is more Paris than it is Vicenza, Italy. But again, this is all about a very ideal design. Jefferson can do 5 kinds of math. He loves geometry. So from the how do you form the octagon to the cube surrounded by octagon rooms surrounded by the outer octagon, to the geometries in the landscape, to the circle of the core, to the circle and a square and rectangular yard. It's all about numbers. And Jefferson was all about numbers and proportions. So we can say that late in his life, Jefferson finally had the liberty to pursue his own happiness. And I want to read you a couple other things. Jefferson said, happiness is the aim of life, and virtue is the foundation of happiness. To Maria Causeway, he wrote, the most effectual means of being secure against pain is to retire within ourselves and suffice for our own happiness. He said, I have an excellent house I visited 4 times this year, it's 1821, where I'm comfortably fixed and attended, have a few good neighbors, pass my time there in tranquility and retirement, much adapted to my age and indolence. I want to read you, it's worth reading a little bit of what the granddaughter wrote about Jefferson. This was Ellen Randolph, who wrote in the 1850s, my grandfather was very happy during these sojourns in a comparatively simple and secluded district, far from noise and news, both of which he got too much at Monticello, and we, his granddaughters, were very happy too. It was a pleasant change for us, a variety in life and manners. We saw, too, more of our dear grandfather at those times than any other. He interested himself in all we did, thought, or read. He would talk to us about his own youth and early friends, tell us stories of former days. He seemed really to take as much pleasure in these conversations with us as if we had been older and wiser people. Such was the influence of his affectionate, cheerful temper, that his grandchildren were as much at their ease with him as if they had not loved and honored and revered him more than any other earthly being. I not only listened with intense interest to all he said, but answered with perfect freedom, told my own opinions and impressions, gave him my own view of things, asked questions, made remarks, and in short, felt as free and as happy as if I had been with companions of my own age. Now, which grandparent wouldn't want your grandchildren to say that about you? Yeah. I could read you more, but I think we've probably had enough sitting for one night. So anyway, this is an invitation to come visit because my pictures don't do it justice. Thank you. Happy to answer any questions. I
Questions?
Raise your hand if you
I,
have a
I,
question.
I threw too much at you probably to even think about, but as I said, it's better to introduce you to many facets, especially since a lot of people haven't been there.
We've got a question. Oh, who's the first? Oh, right here. All right.
Yes, are there more restorations work ongoing without a deadline?
This spring, we finished the architectural restoration of the house, which was a 34-year project. So the main part of that is done. The landscape restoration will go on for a long time. Beyond the core, there's the plantation landscape to deal with. There are outbuildings to reconstruct. There are two 1850s slave dwellings that need to be restored. Even though they're post-Jefferson, they're important. We've done archaeology on other slave cabin sites. We know what we can reconstruct. Architecturally, a lot of people say it's kind of sad you finished the restoration because we've been coming here for 25 years watching it. On the other hand, that last phase of doing the finishes and the colors is kind of the icing on the cake to understand Jefferson's aesthetic choices. Every material in that house was a Jeffersonian choice that's not like somebody else doing a house. And once you put it all together now, you can finally appreciate the whole picture. It'll never be fully furnished because we don't know about the furniture. We have some reproduction furniture in there now, but it's not about the furniture. Monticello has the furniture and the great stuff. Poplar Forest, is about something else.
Another question? Judy, wait a moment. Dear. Shropshire.
Did Thomas Jefferson acknowledge his three Hemmings grandsons? Were they allowed in the house? Did they come for dinner?
Jefferson's three sons worked next to him in the house for 10 years. They lived on the lower level with their uncle. Sometimes the Hemmings men were independent, stayed at Poplar Forest, Jefferson's at Monticello. And of course, in the rare of rarities, John Hemmings and Thomas Jefferson write letters back and forth about what they're doing. Jefferson trusted the Hemmings crew to do all the work without his supervision, which was pretty remarkable. They are still the Shadow family. They are not mentioned by name. Their names were Beverly, Madison, and Eston Hemmings. They are never mentioned by name except in a slave roll, and except for one time Jefferson bought cabbages from them. But they are there next to him, next to the granddaughters, but like most enslaved people, they're kind of not seen. It might be a stretch, but I like to think of Poplar Forest as the masterpiece of the Hemmings craftsmen. It was Jefferson's masterpiece, but they crafted something very special. The sad thing is nobody saw it. As I said, Jefferson only invited 2 foreign friends to come to Poplar Forest. Family came, neighbors came, but if you built a Poplar Forest, you would show it off to all your friends. Jefferson could have built a rustic retreat if nobody was going to see it. And yet, it took him 14 years to put every little piece into this perfect work. And you have to ask, if nobody sees it, what's the point? The point was, this was not just a retreat, it was a treat for himself. At the end of his life, he's given to his country. He wants this one exquisite thing for himself. Why wouldn't he show it off? I think the answer is it was so special to him, he didn't want to share it with anybody. It really is, the most intimate look at the American Sphinx. The man who is still the mystery man. After working with him almost every day for 34 years, I can't tell you I know the man. If you think you know Jefferson, you're fooling yourself. But Poplar Forest is where you can get the closest to the private man. And as I said, if you're in there by yourself, you can hear the sound of his mind in this really, very important neoclassical work.
Question?
Okay, one more question.
Ruben.
Hi, Jarvis. Is there any documentation? Is there any you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. Is there any documentation about what he put on the walls? I mean, Monticello has so many paintings and, engravings and that sort of thing. I wonder if there's any documentation, or maybe he left them bare.
No, the walls weren't bare. They were filled with things. We don't know what they were. I can tell you where there was a Jefferson something hanging on there by the hole, what kind of plaster filled it, what kind of nail was in it. What all those things were, we don't know. And I would not go out on that limb to guess at what was in Poplar Forest. If it was a generic house, sure, you could guess at what's in there. Not with Jefferson. There was never an inventory done when he died. Well, I shouldn't say that. There might have been an inventory. It's never been found. Looked in 3 or 4 counties. So we don't know what Francis Epps took to Florida with him. There's no good inventory when he dies of what came out of Poplar Forest, except the library. So in the 1870s, Francis falls on hard times. He sends the Poplar Forest Library up to New York City to be auctioned off. And there's a catalog description of every book, every title, the author, the binding, the size, the city it was published in. We know exactly what it looked like. Have we ever seen one of those books? No, because there's no record of who bought these books at auction in New York City. And Jefferson doesn't sign his name in a book. But I had started collecting the exact same books for Poplar Forest Library, but we still got a long way to go. But just that one picture I showed you, on paper it was one title, The Poets of Great Britain. You'd think it's a book. It was 109 volumes of The Poets of Great Britain.
So question, Jefferson's roofs are very complex, and I'm right here.
Sorry.
Very complex and difficult. How did you rediscover or discover the roofs and make the decisions you did to actually get them to work?
The serrated roof, he also calls the zigzag roof, the terrace roof. He does that a half a dozen ways. He first redoes the roofs at Monticello when he's in the White House about 1804 or 5. He does them on the President's House roof. He does them for Madison at Montpelier. He does it at UVA 3 different ways. And he does it at Poplar Forest 2 different ways. Most of that, some of that is still there, but because of his letters, we know what he did at Poplar Forest. Late in life, he wrote a long description to somebody about how to do these things, and there was no doubt, what it was at Poplar Forest, but he does it. He never is satisfied. He's always tweaking it to make it better because it did have its inherent problems. Yeah.
Travis, this has been so enjoyable, and every time I hear you, it's great. But as a board member, I'm going to ask you, would you say a word about the foundation that has done this over the last 40 years? Thanks.
As I said, it was a narrow rescue. 2 local historical groups tried not once, twice to save it and couldn't do it. It came down to 5 people who showed up at a hotel one Sunday when the editor of the paper said, "Who's interested in saving Poplar Forest?" They were some businessmen, and I attributed the early success of Poplar Forest not with preservation professionals, but businessmen who said, if we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. They didn't know what that meant, but they never wavered on doing the best thing possible. And over the course of our restoration journey, it wasn't hard for you as a donor to come there and see why it's taking longer and why it's costing money. Seeing it is believing it. And that became the wonderful experience for visitors who came year after year. But Poplar Forest, like all the 5 presidential house sites in Virginia, is private. It's not federal, it's not state, even though out-of-state people think it's got to be Park Service or whatever. Poplar Forest, like Mount Vernon, Montpelier, Monticello, is a private nonprofit, and you got to raise the money every year for doing that. And just as I said, even people writing big, thick biographies of Jefferson miss it. It's still, a challenge because Monticello gets 400,000 visitors a year. Poplar Forest gets about 25,000. So it's still a well-kept secret, but you are all now deputized as ambassadors to spread the word and come visit.
So how many people have actually visited Poplar Forest over the years?
Pretty good.
Wow, 6 times.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Travis,
Yeah.
thank you so much for what it is unbelievably illuminating when you think about what Poplar Forest is and the relationship to Villa Rotunda. Therefore, my question is this. The 20-foot cube, which is not exactly, duplicated anywhere else, is that something that's the freedom of expression for Thomas Jefferson in a lifelike form that makes him unique in architectural history?
Well, to answer that, I would say, again, you got to remember what Poplar Forest was. It's an idealistic, occasional retreat. And in my book, I go into the history of retreats, who used them. There are country houses, there are seasonal houses, there are all kinds of seasonal houses families use in the summer. Poplar Forest was a year-round retreat. And more importantly, all these other examples I found were family places. You'd go there, and when you're there with your family, you have big parties for all your friends and neighbors. Poplar Forest was an intellectual retreat for one man, and that makes it very unique. I can't find another example except possibly one in Philadelphia that was William Penn's grandson, who came back from England, built this really nice little house, but then went back to England. But architecturally, it is unique. As I said, it's the first big octagon. You can call it Jeffersonian as much as anything. And Jefferson had his own style that he starts. A lot of people don't realize when he did Monticello, we call him Monticello number 1 in 1769, he's a bachelor. That's a very ambitious house for a bachelor to take on. He not only takes on the role of the architect, he takes on the role of the builder, which was unheard of. But by the time he does Poplar Forest, he has stuck with that one Roman classical style all through his life and refined it to an infinite degree, whereas a lot of other people are jumping ship to do Greek revival and other things. He knows what he wants, and he just works with it his whole life. And that makes it very special and unique. And there's no other amateur architect in America who did so many buildings. And granted, a lot of them are on paper, but there's no other person of his time who was an amateur who touches him in that way. So, okay, thank you very much.